Booters and stressors are simply distributed denial of service as a service terms. They're words which try to lend a little bit more legitimacy to what is ultimately a very malicious service. And I thought where we'd start this section of the course is by looking at an article that came out only a couple of days before recording. Here's why this is significant. It's the figures. These services can be very cheap to procure. In this example, $60. Yet the damage they can do is enormous, $720,000, or depending on how you measure it, up to $7.2 million a day. The leverage you get out of money spent on DDoS attacks is enormous because they can be so cheap to acquire, and we're going to go and look at one of those specifically in just a moment, yet the cost of the outage of the website can be so high. This article actually mentions the Arbor network research I referred to back in the first module of the course, and in fact they reference one particular statistic that's really significant. Let me jump over and show you that now. When Arbor Networks prepared this report, they did a bunch of surveys of organisations that had been hit by DDoS attacks, and what they actually found was that nearly 2/3 of all the respondents estimated the cost of a DDoS at over $500 a minute. That's $30,000 an hour. Most organisations getting hit by a DDoS attack are bleeding more than 30 grand every 60 minutes. Not only that, but based on these figures here, 43% of them are at least $1,000 a minute. So now we're talking $60,000 an hour plus. And for those really upper echelon organisations, they can be looking at more than $20,000 a minute in lost business whilst a DDoS attack is being mounted. So imagine the leverage the attacker gets. That very small amount of money spent on these booter and stressor tools, costing the target organisation $20,000 every single minute. And we're talking about services that are really readily available. In fact, they're so readily available, you can easily find information about them out there in the clear web. Let me give you an example of what I mean. This is a review site for services offering DDoS for sale. And you can see these terms here that we've seen many times now. Stressor, booter, DDoSer, and of course in the last module we looked at botnets, which is often the mechanism by which these services are delivered. Now it's really interesting to see so many of the concepts we've touched on throughout this course all come together here. So for example, we can see here there's a recent post about how to kick someone off Xbox Live. So that's the gaming angle attack we talked about. In fact, the very specific targeted individual attack against a gaming participant. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see a diagram here about how DDoS works. We can see zombie PCs here. We spoke about zombies when we were talking about botnets earlier on. So evidently, many of the services that are being reviewed here are using compromised machines infected by malicious software in order to form part of the botnet. Another curious thing as we scroll down a little bit further is this question about whether DDoS is illegal. Now, obviously a site like this is going to have a very vested interest in trying to establish legitimacy. And the vague answer here, the bit about yes and no, and about it being sketchy at best as to whether DDoS is illegal or not, is extremely misguided advice. As I mentioned earlier on, we've seen cases, such as the 14 attackers who used DDoS tools against PayPal, being brought up on charges. Now they eventually settled and copped fines and legal fees and huge amounts of distress. And that is what people getting involved in DDoS, whether it's running Loic or procuring services, need to expect. As much as proponents of DDoS like to argue that they're simply exercising their freedom of speech and protesting whatever cause it is they're trying to support, when the intent is to maliciously take a site offline in order to cause it damage, there's a very good chance it's not going to work out real well for them. And in fact, as we scroll further down the page, we can see advice on how to use a VPN in order to try and conceal your identity. And the reason they're giving that advice is because if you are mounting a DDoS attack against someone, you really don't want to be found out because there are very serious legal consequences. The real point I want to make here though is just how mainstream these tools are. They're out there on the clear web. They're giving advice, in some cases legal advice, about the legitimacy of these services, and they're masquerading as stress testers. These are very easily accessible, very mainstream services, and procuring them is extremely simple. In fact, let's move on and actually have a look inside a denial of service as a service offering. And I want to show you just how professional these services have become.